behind the polished gates of Kensington Palace, where royal protocol dictates every breath and bow, something extraordinary was brewing. Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana, third in line to the British throne, was about to shatter every expectation the world had of a proper royal child. What started as whispered concerns from her protection officers would soon explode into a defining moment that revealed the true spirit burning within this young princess. The royal family had always prided itself on discretion, dignity, and composure above all else. But Charlotte was different. Even at her young age, she possessed something her great-grandmother Queen Elizabeth II would have recognized immediately: the fierce determination of a true Windsor warrior. The palace walls had witnessed centuries of royal drama, but nothing quite prepared them for the day when their youngest princess would take matters into her own hands and show the world that royal blood runs with the courage of a lion. This is the untold story of how a moment of childhood injustice awakened something powerful in Princess Charlotte, transforming her from a protected royal child into a force that even seasoned palace guards would never forget. What happened that autumn afternoon would ripple through the halls of power and change how the royal family viewed strength, courage, and what it truly means to serve and protect others. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Kensington Palace as Royal Protection Officer James Mitchell began his shift, checking the security protocols that governed every moment of the young royals' lives. At 28, Mitchell had already served in Afghanistan and worked protection details for foreign dignitaries, but nothing had prepared him for the unique challenges of safeguarding the Cambridge children. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis lived their lives under constant scrutiny, their every public appearance choreographed down to the smallest detail. Charlotte, now 8 years old, had always been different from her brothers. While George carried himself with the careful reserve expected of a future king, and Louis charmed everyone with his infectious giggles, Charlotte possessed an intensity that sometimes caught even her parents off guard. She studied people with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense and politeness. The palace staff had learned to recognize the signs when Charlotte's famous temper was building: a slight narrowing of her eyes, a straightening of her shoulders that mirrored her father's military posture. The princess attended Thomas's Battersea, the same prestigious preparatory school where her brothers had studied. The school prided itself on creating global citizens who were confident, creative, and compassionate. But for Charlotte, school represented something more complex than education. It was her first real taste of life beyond the palace walls, where her royal status couldn't shield her from the social dynamics that governed childhood friendships and rivalries. Mitchell often drove Charlotte to school, watching her in the rearview mirror as she sat quietly in the back seat, sometimes reading, sometimes simply staring out the window with that thoughtful expression that made her seem older than her years. She rarely complained about anything, but he had begun to notice subtle changes in her behavior over the past few weeks. She was quieter than usual, more withdrawn during the car rides. When he asked about her day, her responses were shorter, less animated than the enthusiastic stories she used to share about her classes and friends. The other protection officers had noticed it too. Sarah Coleman, who often accompanied Charlotte during school events, mentioned that the princess seemed to be spending more time alone during break periods. Where she once could be found laughing with a group of classmates or organizing impromptu games, Charlotte was increasingly seen sitting by herself, reading or simply observing the playground activities from a distance. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had also expressed concern to the protection team. During their weekly security briefings, she mentioned that Charlotte had been unusually quiet at home, declining invitations to play dates that she previously would have accepted eagerly. William had tried to engage his daughter in conversation about school, but Charlotte deflected his questions with the same polite responses she gave to reporters during official engagements. The school itself maintained strict policies about treating the royal children like any other students. Teachers were instructed not to give them special treatment or attention that might single them out from their peers. This approach worked well for George, who naturally blended into group activities and seemed comfortable with his classmates. But for Charlotte, who had inherited both her mother's people skills and her father's protective instincts, the situation was more complicated. Mitchell had been briefed on the delicate balance the royal family tried to maintain. They wanted their children to have as normal an education as possible, but they also understood that normal was a relative concept when you're third in line to the throne. The protection officers were trained to remain invisible during school hours, positioning themselves strategically around the campus without interfering in the children's daily interactions. But invisibility didn't mean blindness, and Mitchell had begun to notice things that concerned him. During pickup times, he observed Charlotte walking to the car alone while other children clustered in animated groups, chattering about their plans for the afternoon. When parents gathered for school events, he noticed how some adults seemed to keep their distance from Catherine, creating an invisible bubble around the royal family that inadvertently isolated Charlotte from potential friendships. The princess had always been remarkably resilient for her age, but even the strongest children could be worn down by persistent social pressure. Mitchell remembered his own school days, how cruel children could be to anyone who stood out as different. Being royal was perhaps the ultimate form of standing out, and Charlotte bore that burden with a grace that impressed everyone around her. During their afternoon security briefings, the protection team discussed their observations with careful professionalism. They were trained to assess threats and report unusual behavior, but the line between security concerns and normal childhood struggles was often blurry. How do you protect a child from loneliness? How do you shield a princess from the natural consequences of her extraordinary circumstances? The school's head teacher, Mrs. Henderson, maintained regular communication with the palace about all three Cambridge children. Her reports about Charlotte were generally positive: excellent academic performance, respectful behavior, good participation in class discussions. But, between the lines, Mitchell detected the same concerns that were troubling the protection team. Charlotte was becoming increasingly isolated, not through any fault of her own, but because of the complex social dynamics that surrounded her royal status. One afternoon, as Mitchell waited in the designated parking area for school dismissal, he witnessed a small incident that crystallized his growing concerns. Charlotte emerged from the school building walking alone, her school bag slung over her shoulder with military precision. A group of girls from her class was walking ahead of her, laughing and talking animatedly about weekend plans. As Charlotte approached, one of the girls turned back and said something that made the others giggle. Charlotte's stride didn't falter, but Mitchell saw the slight tightening around her eyes that he had learned to recognize as a sign of distress. When Charlotte reached the car, she climbed into the back seat with her usual polite greeting. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mitchell. How was your day?" Her voice carried the trained courtesy of royal protocol, but there was something hollow in her tone that made Mitchell's chest tighten with concern. As they drove through the busy London streets toward Kensington Palace, Mitchell found himself watching Charlotte more carefully in the rearview mirror. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, gazing out at the passing cityscape with an expression that seemed too serious for an 8-year-old. The easy chatter that had once filled their car rides had given way to thoughtful silence that spoke volumes about whatever was troubling the young princess. That evening, during the handover briefing with the night shift, Mitchell shared his observations with his colleagues. The pattern was becoming clear. Charlotte was struggling with something at school, something that went beyond typical childhood disputes or academic challenges. The protection team had a responsibility to keep the royal children safe, but this was a different kind of threat, one that couldn't be neutralized with careful planning and strategic positioning. The palace machine continued to function with its usual precision. Official engagements were planned and executed flawlessly. Public appearances showcased the Cambridge family as the perfect example of modern royalty, relatable yet regal, accessible yet appropriately distant. But behind the carefully constructed public image, a young princess was fighting her own private battle, learning lessons about power, privilege, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Mitchell had served in enough dangerous situations to recognize the calm before the storm. Something was building in Princess Charlotte, something that would soon demand expression. The question wasn't whether she would act, it was when and what form that action would take. In his experience, the quietest people often proved to be the most dangerous when finally provoked beyond their breaking point. As autumn settled over London and the days grew shorter, the protection team maintained their vigilant watch over the royal children. But they were about to learn that sometimes the greatest threat to a princess's safety comes not from external forces, but from the fire burning within her own heart, a fire that, once ignited, could change everything they thought they knew about protecting royalty in the modern world. The first signs of real trouble emerged on a gray Tuesday morning in October when Mitchell noticed Charlotte's knuckles were scraped raw as she climbed into the car after school. When he asked about the injury, she simply said she had fallen during break time, but her tone carried the careful neutrality he had learned to associate with royal evasions. The princess had been trained from birth never to lie, but she had also mastered the art of answering questions without revealing uncomfortable truths. Sarah Coleman, who had been monitoring the school's security cameras as part of her routine duties, pulled Mitchell aside the next day with disturbing news. The cameras had captured Charlotte during the previous afternoon's break period, and what they showed painted a very different picture from the princess's explanation about falling. Charlotte had been cornered near the school's garden area by 3 older girls from Year 5. The camera angle didn't capture audio, but their body language was unmistakably aggressive. The footage showed Charlotte backing away from the group, her hands raised defensively. One of the older girls, a tall blonde named Victoria Pembridge, whose father was rumored to be connected to several tabloid newspapers, appeared to be doing most of the talking. The other 2 girls, Emma Blackwood and Sophia Hartwell, flanked Victoria like lieutenants in some cruel childhood army. Charlotte's face remained remarkably composed throughout the encounter, but her body language betrayed her distress. What happened next shocked both protection officers. Instead of continuing to retreat or seeking help from a teacher, Charlotte suddenly stepped forward and said something that made all 3 older girls step back. The princess's posture had completely transformed, shoulders squared, chin lifted, every inch the descendant of warrior queens. For a moment, she looked exactly like her father during his military service, radiating an authority that transcended her age and size. The confrontation ended when a teacher approached the group, sending the older girls scurrying away with carefully innocent expressions. Charlotte spent the remainder of break time sitting alone on a bench, staring at her scraped knuckles with an expression that Mitchell found deeply unsettling. It was the look of someone who had discovered something important about themselves, something that couldn't be undone. That afternoon's car ride was conducted in complete silence. Charlotte sat in the back seat with unusual stillness, her injured hands folded carefully in her lap. Mitchell caught her eyes in the rearview mirror several times, but she seemed to be looking through him rather than at him, lost in thoughts that were clearly far too heavy for a child her age to carry alone. The protection team's evening briefing took on new urgency as they reviewed the security footage and discussed their observations. Protocol dictated that they inform the Prince and Princess of Wales about any incidents involving their children, but the situation was complicated by Charlotte's obvious desire to handle the matter herself. Interfering too quickly might undermine her developing independence and self-confidence, but allowing the situation to escalate could put her in genuine danger. William and Catherine were informed of the incident during their regular security briefing, but their response surprised the protection team. Rather than immediately intervening or contacting the school, they asked for continued monitoring while they decided how best to approach Charlotte about the situation. The royal couple understood better than anyone the delicate balance between protecting their children and allowing them to develop the strength and character that royal duty would eventually demand. Over the following days, Mitchell noticed subtle changes in Charlotte's behavior that suggested she was planning something. She had always been an observant child, but now she seemed to be studying everything around her with new intensity. During car rides, she asked unexpected questions about the protection officers' training, their military backgrounds, and the techniques they used to assess threats. Her questions were posed with the casual curiosity of childhood, but Mitchell detected a deeper purpose behind her inquiries. Charlotte had also begun spending more time in the palace library, researching topics that seemed oddly mature for her age. The librarian, Mrs. Whitmore, mentioned to Catherine that the princess had been reading about conflict resolution, leadership under pressure, and historical accounts of women who had stood up to bullies and tyrants. When Catherine asked Charlotte about her reading choices, the princess explained that she was working on a school project about strong women in history. The lie was beautifully crafted and completely believable, which concerned Catherine more than if Charlotte had simply refused to explain. Her daughter was learning to manipulate the truth with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, a talent that would serve her well in royal life, but was troubling to see emerge so early and under such circumstances. Meanwhile, the situation at school continued to deteriorate. Coleman's surveillance revealed that the bullying had expanded beyond simple verbal confrontations. The older girls had begun a campaign of social isolation, encouraging Charlotte's classmates to exclude her from group activities and conversations. They spread rumors about royal privilege and suggested that Charlotte thought she was better than everyone else because of her family background. The most insidious aspect of their campaign was how they used Charlotte's royal status against her. They knew she couldn't respond with typical childhood retaliation without risking negative publicity for the entire royal family. Every action Charlotte took was scrutinized through the lens of royal protocol, creating an impossible situation where defending herself might be seen as unbecoming of a princess. Charlotte's classmates found themselves caught in an uncomfortable position. Many genuinely liked the princess and enjoyed her company, but the social pressure from the older girls made association with Charlotte risky. The bullies had created an atmosphere where being friends with Charlotte was seen as social suicide, effectively weaponizing the very royal status that should have been Charlotte's protection. Mitchell observed the increasing isolation during pickup times, watching as Charlotte walked alone while her former friends clustered together, shooting guilty glances in her direction. The princess maintained her dignity throughout these encounters, but he could see the toll the situation was taking. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she wasn't sleeping well, and her appetite had clearly diminished based on the untouched lunchboxes that returned home each day. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when Coleman witnessed the most serious incident yet. The three older girls had cornered Charlotte in the bathroom during lunch break, blocking her exit while Victoria Pembridge delivered what appeared to be a particularly vicious verbal assault. The security cameras couldn't capture what was said, but Charlotte's reaction was visible even through the grainy footage. For the first time since the bullying began, Charlotte's composure cracked. Her shoulders shook with suppressed emotion, and she pressed herself against the wall as if trying to disappear entirely. But then something remarkable happened. Instead of breaking down completely, Charlotte seemed to gather herself from some deep internal well of strength. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and said something that made all three bullies step back as if they had been physically struck. When Charlotte finally emerged from the bathroom, her eyes were dry, and her expression was set in lines of grim determination that made her look startlingly like her great-grandmother during the darkest days of World War II. She walked past the older girls without acknowledging their presence, radiating an authority that left them standing speechless in her wake. That afternoon, as Mitchell drove Charlotte home through the busy London traffic, he noticed that the princess seemed different somehow. The quiet sadness that had characterized her recent behavior had been replaced by something else entirely, a focused intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. When Charlotte thanked him for the ride as they arrived at Kensington Palace, her voice carried a new quality that reminded him of commanding officers he had served under in Afghanistan. During the evening briefing, the protection team discussed their growing concern about Charlotte's state of mind. The princess was clearly planning some kind of response to the bullying situation, and her recent research into conflict resolution and historical accounts of resistance suggested that whatever she was contemplating would be carefully thought out and potentially explosive in its consequences. William and Catherine had decided to speak with Charlotte over the weekend, but the protection team worried that events might overtake their careful parental diplomacy. Charlotte had inherited the Windsor gift for strategic thinking, But she had also inherited their legendary temper and their absolute intolerance for injustice. The combination of these traits in an 8-year-old who felt cornered and alone was genuinely concerning. As the weekend approached, Mitchell found himself thinking about the young princess with unusual frequency. In his military career, he had learned to recognize the signs when someone was preparing for battle. Charlotte exhibited all those signs now: the calm determination, the careful planning, the gathering of resources and information. Whatever was coming, it would test not only Charlotte's character, but also the protection team's ability to safeguard a royal child who was determined to fight her own battles, regardless of the consequences. The palace settled into its usual weekend rhythm, but beneath the surface, everyone could sense that something significant was building. Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana was about to teach the world that royal blood carried more than privilege. It carried the responsibility to stand up for justice, no matter the cost. Monday morning arrived with unusual tension crackling through Kensington Palace. Charlotte had spent the weekend in what could only be described as a state of preparation, though for what, nobody was entirely certain. She had practiced her piano with unusual intensity, completed her homework with military precision, and maintained conversations with her family that were perfectly pleasant, yet somehow felt like carefully orchestrated performances. Mitchell noticed the change immediately when Charlotte climbed into the car for the drive to school. Gone was the quiet sadness that had characterized her recent demeanor, replaced by an energy that seemed almost electric. She sat straighter in the back seat, her school uniform immaculate, her hair perfectly arranged in the neat plaits that Catherine had taught her to manage herself. Most striking of all were her eyes, bright with purpose and absolutely fearless. "Mr. Mitchell," Charlotte said as they navigated through the morning London traffic, "what would you do if someone was hurting people who couldn't defend themselves?" Her question was posed with the casual curiosity of childhood, but Mitchell recognized the weight behind it. This wasn't idle wondering. This was a princess seeking validation for a decision she had already made. "Well, Your Royal Highness," Mitchell replied carefully, "I suppose I would try to help them find a way to protect themselves, and I would make sure the person doing the hurting understood that their behavior was unacceptable." He glanced in the rearview mirror, noting the satisfied expression that crossed Charlotte's face at his response. "Even if helping them might get you in trouble," Charlotte pressed, and Mitchell realized he was being tested in some way that would have consequences far beyond this conversation. "Sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting that there might be consequences," he answered honestly. "But that doesn't make it less right." Charlotte nodded solemnly, as if he had confirmed something important, then spent the rest of the drive gazing out the window with an expression of absolute calm that somehow made Mitchell more nervous than any distress would have. The morning at Thomas's Battersea proceeded normally, with Charlotte attending her classes and participating in activities with her usual engagement. But Coleman, monitoring from her strategic position, noticed that the princess was paying closer attention to the movements and patterns of the older girls who had been tormenting her. During break times, Charlotte positioned herself where she could observe their interactions with other students, cataloging their behavior with the systematic attention of someone gathering intelligence. The breakthrough moment came during lunch break when Coleman witnessed something that made her immediately radio for backup. Victoria Pembridge and her companions had targeted a new victim, a quiet girl from year 3 named Lily Chun, whose parents had recently moved to London from Hong Kong. The child spoke English perfectly, but with a slight accent that the bullies seemed to find amusing. They had cornered her near the playground equipment, mimicking her pronunciation and making jokes about her lunch that brought tears to the little girl's eyes. Charlotte observed the scene from across the playground, her expression hardening with each moment that passed. Coleman watched as the princess made a decision that would change everything. Charlotte didn't run to find a teacher or seek help from other students. Instead, she walked directly toward the confrontation with the measured stride of someone who had finally reached the limit of what she was willing to tolerate. What happened next would be discussed in royal protection circles for years to come. Charlotte approached the group of older girls with no visible anger or agitation, but with a presence that somehow commanded immediate attention. Victoria Pembridge, who had been enjoying her power over the younger child, suddenly found herself face to face with a princess who radiated authority that transcended age, size, or social hierarchies. "Step away from her," Charlotte said quietly, her voice carrying across the playground with surprising clarity. The words themselves were simple, but they were delivered with the unmistakable tone of someone who expected immediate obedience. Victoria laughed, perhaps thinking this was another opportunity to humiliate the royal child, but her laughter died when she met Charlotte's eyes. "What are you going to do about it, princess?" Victoria sneered, using Charlotte's title like an insult. "Run and tell your bodyguards? Have her daddy call the queen." The other two girls giggled nervously, but even they seemed to sense that something had shifted in the dynamic. Charlotte stepped closer, and suddenly the playground seemed to fall silent around them. Other children had begun to notice the confrontation, forming a loose circle that kept a respectful distance, but ensured that whatever happened next would have witnesses. Even the younger students seemed to understand that they were about to witness something significant. "I don't need bodyguards to deal with bullies," Charlotte said calmly. "And I certainly don't need my family to fight my battles. What I need is for you to understand that your behavior is unacceptable, and it stops today." She gestured toward Lily Chun, who was still pressed against the playground equipment, tears streaming down her face. "You will apologize to her, and you will leave her alone from now on." Victoria's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Being challenged by someone 3 years younger, regardless of royal status, was apparently beyond her tolerance. "You can't tell us what to do," she snarled, stepping closer to Charlotte in what was clearly meant to be an intimidation tactic. "Just because you're a princess doesn't mean you can boss everyone around." What happened next surprised everyone, including Coleman, who was watching from her security position. Charlotte didn't back down or call for help. Instead, she smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both perfectly polite and absolutely terrifying. It was the smile of someone who had been raised from birth to command respect and who had finally decided to claim that authority. "You're absolutely right," Charlotte said pleasantly. "Being a princess doesn't give me the right to boss people around. But being a decent human being gives me the right to protect people who can't protect themselves. And being raised by parents who taught me about courage, honor, and standing up for what's right gives me the responsibility to act when I see injustice." The playground had fallen completely silent now. Even the teachers who had noticed the gathering crowd seemed reluctant to intervene, sensing that something important was unfolding. Charlotte continued speaking, her voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow carrying to every corner of the space. "You think my royal status makes me weak because I have to follow protocols and be polite all the time. You think you can pick on me because I can't fight back without embarrassing my family. You've been testing me for weeks, trying to find my breaking point." Charlotte paused, letting her words sink in. "Congratulations. You found it." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but Charlotte wasn't finished. The princess had found her voice, and years of careful royal training had given her the tools to use it with devastating effectiveness. "Here's what's going to happen," Charlotte continued, her tone remaining perfectly reasonable while her words carried unmistakable authority. "You're going to apologize to Lily. You're going to apologize to every other student you've bullied this year. And you're going to spend the rest of your time at this school learning how to treat people with the respect and kindness that everyone deserves. And if we don't," Victoria challenged, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Charlotte's smile widened slightly, and, for just a moment, she looked exactly like her great-great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, whose reign had defined an entire era of British history. "Then you'll discover that being a princess actually does come with certain advantages," she said sweetly. "My mother chairs several children's charities that focus on anti-bullying initiatives. My father has connections throughout the educational system. My grandmother has opinions about character and behavior that tend to be taken very seriously by school administrators." The threat was delivered with such polite courtesy that it took a moment for its full implications to sink in. Victoria's face went pale as she realized that she had been systematically tormenting someone who, if she chose to use her family connections, could make life very difficult for her and her accomplices. But more importantly, Charlotte continued, stepping closer to Victoria until they were almost nose to nose. You'll discover that I don't need any of those advantages to deal with bullies. I am Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana of Cambridge, granddaughter of the King of England, great-granddaughter of the longest reigning monarch in British history, and descendant of warriors who defended this nation against enemies far more dangerous than three mean girls in a school playground. The transformation was remarkable. In the space of a few sentences, Charlotte had gone from being the victim of bullying to embodying every inch of her royal heritage. She stood with the bearing of someone born to command, radiating confidence and authority that made her seem far older and more powerful than her 8 years should have allowed. Now, Charlotte said, her voice returning to normal conversational tones, I believe you owe Lily an apology. She stepped aside, creating a clear path between Victoria and the younger girl who was still cowering near the playground equipment. Victoria looked around the assembled crowd, perhaps hoping for support or rescue, but found only expectant faces waiting to see how she would respond to this royal challenge. The social dynamics that had seemed so clear just minutes earlier had been completely overturned by Charlotte's refusal to accept the role of victim that had been assigned to her. I'm sorry, Victoria mumbled, looking at the ground rather than at Lily Chun. Her companions echoed the apology with similar reluctance, but Charlotte wasn't satisfied with their half-hearted compliance. Look at her when you speak, Charlotte commanded, and there was steel in her voice now that brooked no argument. She deserves better than your cowardice. Victoria raised her eyes and repeated the apology, this time making eye contact with Lily, whose tears had stopped flowing as she watched in amazement. The confrontation ended when a teacher finally approached the group, but by then, the real resolution had already taken place. Victoria and her friends retreated with their heads down, their power structure completely shattered by Charlotte's refusal to be intimidated. The other students began to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they had witnessed. Charlotte walked over to Lily Chun, who was still standing frozen near the playground equipment. Are you all right? She asked gently, and her voice had returned to the kind, caring tone of a child genuinely concerned for another's well-being. Lily nodded mutely, then surprised Charlotte by throwing her arms around the princess in a grateful hug. Thank you, she whispered, and Charlotte returned the embrace with warmth that showed her essential kindness beneath all the royal training and inherited authority. As the lunch break ended and students began moving back toward the school building, Charlotte walked with quiet dignity that somehow managed to acknowledge the significance of what had just occurred without seeming to gloat over her victory. She had found her voice, claimed her power, and used both to protect someone who needed defending. Coleman radioed her observations to Mitchell, her voice tight with professional admiration and personal pride. Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana had just demonstrated that royal training, when combined with genuine courage and moral conviction, could be a formidable weapon against injustice. The quiet, isolated child of recent weeks had transformed into a force that would be reckoned with for decades to come. The news of Charlotte's playground confrontation spread through Thomas's Battersea with a speed that only school gossip could achieve. By the time the final bell rang, every student seemed to know that Princess Charlotte had faced down the school's most notorious bullies and emerged victorious. But the real impact of her actions would take much longer to unfold, rippling through the school community and ultimately reaching the highest levels of the royal family. Mitchell noticed the change immediately when he arrived for pickup duty. Instead of walking alone to the car as she had for weeks, Charlotte was surrounded by classmates who seemed eager to talk with her. The social isolation that had characterized her recent school experience had evaporated overnight, replaced by the kind of respect that couldn't be commanded or inherited. It had to be earned through actions that demonstrated true character. As Charlotte approached the car, Mitchell observed her carefully. The princess carried herself differently now, with a confidence that seemed unshakable, but not arrogant. She had discovered something important about herself during the confrontation, something that would shape her approach to challenges for the rest of her life. When she climbed into the back seat, her greeting was warm, but carried a new quality of self-possession that impressed the experienced protection officer. "How was your day, Your Royal Highness?" Mitchell asked, though he already knew much of what had transpired through Coleman's detailed reports. Charlotte considered the question seriously before answering. "It was educational, Mr. Mitchell. I learned some important things about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Her response was measured and thoughtful, but Mitchell detected satisfaction beneath her diplomatic phrasing. During the drive back to Kensington Palace, Charlotte seemed more relaxed than she had been in weeks. She asked about Mitchell's day, inquired after his family, and commented on the changing autumn colors in Hyde Park as they passed. The easy conversation that had once characterized their car rides had returned, but with a new depth that reflected Charlotte's recent experiences. Word of the incident had reached the palace before Charlotte's return. Coleman's security report had been forwarded to William and Catherine's private secretaries, who had immediately briefed the Prince and Princess of Wales on their daughter's actions. The royal couple's reaction was complex, pride in Charlotte's courage and moral conviction mixed with concern about the implications of her very public display of royal authority. That evening, William and Catherine sat down with Charlotte for what the palace staff recognized as one of those crucial parental conversations that would influence a royal child's understanding of their role and responsibilities. The discussion took place in the family's private sitting room, away from the formal environments where official royal business was usually conducted. "We understand there was some excitement at school today," Catherine began gently, settling beside Charlotte on the comfortable sofa that had been carefully chosen to create a relaxed family atmosphere. William took a seat across from them, his military bearing evident even in casual clothing, but his expression warm with paternal concern. Charlotte looked at both her parents with the direct honesty that had always characterized her personality. "There was a situation that needed addressing," she said carefully, and both William and Catherine recognized their own diplomatic training reflected in their daughter's response. "Would you like to tell us about this situation?" William asked, and his tone carried the perfect balance of parental authority and genuine interest that he had learned from his own father during similar conversations years earlier. What followed was Charlotte's first-hand account of the bullying campaign that had been directed at her and other students, delivered with the clear, factual reporting style that royal children learned early. She explained how the older girls had systematically isolated her socially, used her royal status as a weapon against her, and ultimately targeted a younger, more vulnerable child who had no resources to defend herself. "I try to handle it the way you and Mummy taught me," Charlotte explained, looking directly at her parents as she spoke. "I was polite. I didn't respond to their provocations. I tried to remove myself from confrontational situations. But when they started hurting Lily, I realized that sometimes being polite isn't enough. Sometimes you have to take action." Catherine and William exchanged glances, recognizing the moral reasoning that had driven their daughter's decision. Charlotte had articulated something that many adults struggled to understand: the difference between avoiding conflict for its own sake and avoiding conflict while injustice continued unchallenged. "Tell us about the action you decided to take," William said, and Charlotte launched into a detailed description of the playground confrontation. Her account was remarkably accurate compared to the security footage that had captured the incident, but what struck her parents most was how clearly Charlotte had thought through her approach before acting. "I knew that if I responded with anger or violence, it would reflect badly on our family," Charlotte explained. "But I also knew that I couldn't let them continue hurting people just because I was afraid of causing embarrassment. So I decided to use the advantages I do have, my education, my training in public speaking, and, yes, my royal status, to make them understand that their behavior was unacceptable." The conversation continued for over an hour, with William and Catherine carefully exploring Charlotte's motivations, her decision-making process, and her understanding of the consequences her actions might have. What emerged was a portrait of a young girl who had inherited not just royal privilege, but also the sense of responsibility that must accompany such advantages. Are you angry with me? Charlotte asked as the conversation wound down, and for the first time that evening, she sounded like the 8-year-old child she was rather than the poised young woman she was becoming. Catherine gathered her daughter into a warm embrace. We're not angry, darling. We're proud of you for standing up for someone who needed protection. But we also want to make sure you understand the position you're in and how your actions as a princess can affect many people beyond just yourself. William joined the embrace, and for a moment they were simply a family dealing with the complex challenges of raising children who would one day serve the nation in roles of enormous responsibility. The crown carries weight, Charlotte, he said softly. Not just the physical crown that your grandfather wears, but the responsibility that comes with our family's position. Today you felt that weight for the first time, and you carried it well. The palace's response to Charlotte's actions was carefully coordinated through multiple departments. The press office prepared statements in case news of the incident leaked to the media, emphasizing the royal family's commitment to anti-bullying initiatives and their pride in all their children's character development. The Education Office reached out to Thomas's Battersea to ensure appropriate follow-up measures were taken to prevent future incidents. But, perhaps most importantly, the incident sparked serious discussions about how royal children should be prepared for the unique challenges they would face throughout their lives. Charlotte's confrontation with bullying had revealed both the vulnerabilities and the strengths that came with royal status, providing valuable insights for her future education and training. Mrs. Henderson, the head teacher at Thomas's Battersea, requested a meeting with Catherine to discuss the incident and its aftermath. The conversation, held in the school's elegant main office, was both delicate and crucial for Charlotte's continued education. I want to assure you that the behavior Princess Charlotte encountered is absolutely not tolerated at this school, Mrs. Henderson began, her professional composure evident but tinged with genuine remorse. We pride ourselves on creating an inclusive, respectful environment for all our students. Catherine listened carefully as the head teacher outlined the steps the school was taking to address the bullying issue and prevent future incidents. But what she found most interesting was Mrs. Henderson's assessment of Charlotte's response to the situation. I have to say, Your Royal Highness, that Princess Charlotte's handling of this difficult situation was remarkable, Mrs. Henderson continued. She demonstrated maturity, courage, and leadership that would be impressive in someone twice her age. The way she protected another child while maintaining her own dignity was truly inspiring. The meeting concluded with agreements about enhanced monitoring and support systems, but also with recognition that Charlotte had fundamentally changed the social dynamics at the school. Other students had witnessed a princess using her position not for personal advantage, but to protect someone more vulnerable, and that lesson would resonate far beyond the immediate incident. In the weeks that followed, the transformation in Charlotte's school experience was dramatic. The social isolation that had characterized her recent months disappeared entirely, replaced by genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than curiosity about royal status. Students sought her out not because she was a princess, but because she had demonstrated the kind of character they wanted to be around. Victoria Pembridge and her accomplices found themselves facing consequences that extended far beyond Charlotte's intervention. Other students who had been victims of their bullying found the courage to speak up, creating a cascade effect that led to serious disciplinary action and mandatory counseling for the perpetrators. The incident had exposed a pattern of behavior that the school administration could no longer ignore. More significantly, Charlotte's actions had attracted positive attention from unexpected quarters. Anti-bullying organizations reached out to the royal family, hoping to involve Charlotte in age-appropriate advocacy work. Youth leadership programs expressed interest in her participation. The incident had demonstrated that even very young members of the royal family could have meaningful impact on important social issues. Mitchell and the protection team found their role evolving as well. Charlotte's newfound confidence and social engagement required different security considerations than the isolated, withdrawn child they had been protecting just weeks earlier. But they also recognized that their primary mission, keeping the royal children safe, had been accomplished not through their vigilance alone, but through Charlotte's own courage and wisdom. As autumn turned toward winter, Charlotte's life had found a new equilibrium that balanced the privileges and responsibilities of royal status with the normal challenges of growing up. She had learned that being a princess meant more than wearing beautiful clothes and attending grand occasions. It meant using her advantages to protect and serve others, even when doing so required personal courage and sacrifice. The playground confrontation became a defining moment in Charlotte's young life, but it also served as an early indicator of the kind of leader she might become. She had faced her first real test of character and emerged with a deeper understanding of both her own capabilities and the true meaning of royal duty. Years later, royal historians would point to this incident as the moment when Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana truly began her journey toward becoming the kind of royal the modern world needed. Someone who understood that true nobility came not from bloodline or title, but from the courage to stand up for justice regardless of the personal cost. The warrior princess had indeed emerged, and the realm was better for it.